tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. This afternoon I'm going to speak on a topic by request. I was asked to speak about a particularly cheerful topic. I talk about death, which is a very standard traditional kind of Theravada or Buddhist theme. In the First Noble Truth of the Buddha, he lists as one of the primary examples of suffering birth, sickness, old age, and death. And this defines the existential dilemma of human beings, or all beings actually, caught between birth and death. These are the particular kinds of suffering, birth, sickness, old age, and death, that no worldly measures can make an end of. We're kind of stuck with those. This is the basic facts or attributes of human existence in any kind of society, in any historical period. There's always birth, sickness, old age, and death. And it was these existential facts of life that inspired the young Prince Siddhartha to go forth and seek wisdom in the forest. How can beings endure living in this condition, subject to birth, sickness, old age, and death? The fact of death is really, at the last analysis, it's no more than an expression of the universal law of anicca, or impermanence. Everything which exists will cease. That which comes into origination will come to cessation. And this applies to our human organism as well as to anything else. The fact of being born entails, as an absolute necessity, the fact of dying. That which is born will come to death. Death is the ending of one period of life, one continuum, one body-mind organism. And it's inevitable. It comes to every being. The raw fact of death is, however, the only certainty. We don't know when we're going to die, how we're going to die, where we're going to die. All of this is unknown to us. But there is just this inevitable reality that every breath we take is one closer to the inevitable ending. Even the Devas, although their lifespans are very long, reckoned in hundreds of thousands or millions of years by human reckoning, the lifespan of a Deva comes to an end, and they come to their own death as a Deva. They cease to be. For humans, it's much shorter. And to the Devas, we appear as transient and and flickering as mayflies would seem to us. They're appalled at the shortness of human life. The process of dying is something that in Tibetan Buddhism has been studied and elaborated in some detail. In the Theravada, there's less attention paid to the details of the process. In the Visuddhimagga, there is some brief discussion of the process of dying, and there's talk of the dying person experiencing sign of karma or the sign of destiny. That the mind in the last moments will either go towards the sign of karma, which means having a strong vision of things done in the life that are karmically powerful, or a sign of destiny, which is the mind going forward and seeing a sign of the coming rebirth. There was a woman I spoke to once who worked in a hospice, and she saw many people die. And she was well learned in Buddhist, Theravada Buddhist scripture, so she knew about this sign of destiny. And she said that she could see it in the patients, that some patients went to their death very peaceful, and it seemed at the last very happy. Even if they were suffering before, at the very last moments they seemed very happy, joyous. And other ones went with terror and horror in their expression. This is another great uncertainty of death, is where do we go afterwards? What will be the condition of our next rebirth? And this is probably the final horror of death, is that it inevitably leads to birth. And one goes back into the same milieu again in a better or worse condition. So the goal of the Buddhist path is to make an end of this process. The attainment of arahatship, the final realization of nibbana, the entry into nibbana, is to enter the unconditioned. So this process of birth and death is made an end of. House builder, thy ridgepole is broken. Or these are metaphors, or the being is like a palm tree stump, not arising again. So one ends this cyclical process. So when a arahant or a Buddha dies, the texts don't use the same language. They don't call it dying and death generally, but they call it entering parinibbana, meaning nibbana without residue. If nibbana is attained in the life, it's nibbana with residue. The residue of the old karma keeps the body functioning until the moment of death. Then there's no new karma to generate a new body. But until one has attained to the final goal, not only is death a certainty, but so is is rebirth. And that is in many ways something worse than death, because you're starting over again subject to birth, sickness, old age, and death. You haven't escaped. In being aware of or contemplating death, the important thing is to understand and make it viscerally real for yourself that I too shall die. We have a tendency in our culture to try and escape from the idea of death, to not think about it or to put it off. And this is especially probably true for younger people who think, oh, my death is many decades away. Carl Jung once wrote that in his clinical experience, he divided his patients into two. Patients younger than 40, most of their problems had something or other to do with sex and reproduction. After age 40, it was fear of death. It took over in the mind. But culturally, we try and escape from the reality of death. We avoid thinking about it or looking at it. And this causes then death, when it comes, to be more difficult. It comes as a surprise. The Buddha gave us one of the meditations that he recommended to be done frequently is contemplation of death, maranasati. And this is one of the meditations that is not so much a meditation as we tend to think of it, but a contemplation, a skillful use of thought, a yoniso manasikara, to reflect, a reflection on death. And there's quite a extensive write-up on this practice in the Visuddhimagga, and I've made some notes on it here on the different ways. In the Visuddhimagga, it breaks it down into 8 ways of contemplating death. The first is to contemplate death as having the appearance of a murderer. And this is a reference to a parable or a teaching story that the Buddha gave at one time about how we should walk through life. He said, imagine there was a county fair with games and shows and entertainments and music and dancing and everybody having a good time. And the king orders you to carry a bowl full of this precious oil to give as a prize to one of the performers. And you were not to spill a single drop. And to make sure you paid attention, there would be a man walking behind you with a sword. And if you spilled a single drop, he'd lop off your head. And the Buddha says, do you think that fellow carrying the bowl of oil would be looking around at the singers and dancers, enjoying the show, or pay attention to it, to every step? So death is like that, like a murderer that follows around our entire life and can lop off our head at any moment. Another way is as the ruin of success. This is that death in the end makes futility of everything. It doesn't matter what you've accomplished, how much you've learned, how much you've earned, what kind of relationships you've had, how famous you are, how wealthy you are. When the moment of death comes, it's all gone. So in the face of death, all of life is essentially futile. And then the third way is by comparison. And they give 7 examples. You compare how various other beings have died, beings that are more noteworthy or important or greater than yourself in some way, and even they die. The first example they give is those of great fame. And this is particularly poignant in the example given in the Visuddhimagga because it lists names of famous people that have died. And it lists I think maybe like half a dozen names. And most of them nobody knows who they are now at all, and maybe one or two that experts in ancient India might know, but these were given at the time as being the household names that would be obvious. So even their fame is impermanent and has faded with time. With those of great merit, think of beings that have been very saintly or meritorious. No matter what good works they may have done, they still, in the end, they come to death like everyone else. For those of great worldly power, think of great rulers and people who had whole nations at their beck and call, and now they're gone, they're dead. Those of great supernormal power, those of great understanding, the wise, or the learned, and even the Pacheka Buddhas and Buddhas, they come to an end of their lifespan. So even fully enlightened beings. So none of these things, wealth or fame or power or wisdom or even enlightenment, can allow a being to escape from death. Then the fourth method is sharing this body with many. And in the understanding of the Visuddhimagga, the medical understanding of the time, they talked about the 80 families of worms that dwell in the belly and ready at any time to turn against you and destroy you. But we now have much more understanding of all the different kinds of microbes and the swarms of beings, symbiotes and parasites that exist within and on the human body. And an imbalance in these beings or the incursion of foreign beings can cause the destruction of the body. So this is also a good contemplation on the body as not me, not mine, the not self nature of the body. I've read that in the human body there are more microbial cells than there are actual human cells. The body's swarming with bacteria and other minute beings. As to the frailty of life, this is the fifth method, considering the precariousness of life, that anybody can die at any time from multiple numerous accidents or diseases. I remember some years ago there was a story in the news about a man who made his living as a daredevil, that he did these stunts like walking a tightrope over Niagara Falls and all these sorts of extreme stunts. And the way he died was he was on a vacation or on his holidays, and he went home to where he grew up, to New Zealand, and he went out one day to go to this corner store, and he actually slipped on a banana peel and cracked his head on the pavement. That was how he died. So, so it really doesn't take much to kill a person. A crack on the head, a automobile accident, a fall. Our bodies are actually quite fragile. The sixth way is on the signlessness of death, and I've already mentioned this, that although we're certain death will come, we don't know the cause of death, whether it will be illness or accident or simple old age. Now, we don't know when it will happen, whether it will happen tomorrow or 5 years from now or 20 years from now. And we don't know where it will happen. Will it happen at home or when we're abroad? None of these things we can know. The seventh way is to the limitedness of the extent. There is a finite lifespan that in the human form, an extremely long life would be 100 years. Most people die well before that. But there is a definite limit, and every form of life, every type of being has a lifespan, a limit beyond which they cannot go. And the last one is the contemplation of the shortness of the moment. And this is taking the contemplation a step deeper and looking at impermanence as a momentary phenomena, that we're actually in each moment dying and being reborn. In a sense, consciousness is arising to an object and then ceasing, and then consciousness arises again. So there's a momentary impermanence, which is actually the deepest level of understanding of impermanence. So what do we do with this understanding, this knowledge, when we have made it real to ourselves that we're going to die? The first thing is to understand then what is valuable in life. And nothing is more valuable than spiritual progress. So that we can seek to make an end of this process. As long as we're identified with the conditioned, then we're going to be caught in this endless cycle of death and rebirth. The task is to move the mind outside this circle and to try to gain an understanding of a penetration. I shouldn't say an understanding, but a penetration or a realization of the unconditioned. The first realization or glimpse of the unconditioned is the moment of stream entry. And after that occurs, the process of birth and death begins to wind down. And it's said that a stream winner can only be reborn 7 more times at the most. And that all of these births will be human or better. That the lower realms are shut off at that point. Before that point, there's always the possibility of taking a lower rebirth, which is a very terrible fate. So this danger of taking a lower rebirth is something that particularly the Burmese Sayadaws will talk about a lot to inspire diligence in the students to work towards stream entry so you can escape from that fate, the possibility of that fate. So we want to try and consider our next rebirth as something to prepare for, to try and make merit in this life, and to try and develop wisdom and develop the baramis and spiritual qualities to set the ground for a good rebirth. It's also good to bear in mind that the last moments before you die have a very heavy effect, a profound effect on determining where you go afterwards. It is good to try and die with the mind in a wholesome place. And this is not easily done if you haven't made the preparation. It's no good thinking, well, I'll live a completely heedless life, and then when I'm on my deathbed, I'll start practicing Dhamma. That doesn't work, because you're not going to have, very likely, you're not going to have ideal conditions for practice. You're going to have pain, you're going to have dullness, the mind might be addled with drugs. So if you haven't made good grounding before then, you're not going to be able to do it. The one detail that's of some interest from the Tibetan teachings is that we can make a preparation for death by meditating into the sleep states. Because when you fall asleep at night, your faculties fall away in the same order as they do when you're dying. But of course, when you're falling asleep, it's in a milder form. You can always back up and break the process off and wake yourself up. But you're not going to have that control when you're dying. But you can still observe the process of the mind falling away as you go into sleep. You lose the physical senses, you lose the faculty of thought. One by one, these faculties and powers of the mind fall away until you cross the threshold. And it is possible to meditate into the sleep states and observe your mind as you're falling asleep. If you get some skill in this, this also helps to clarify the difference between the chitta, the pure knowing, and all the processing, which people tend to confuse. You can see that the pure knowing, the chitta, has nothing to do with thought, or even with sense impression, or with anything else. It's just a pure light of knowing. And if you learn the skill of centering your being there, you can observe yourself falling asleep. And this is one profound form of meditation in general, is to try and center your being in the awareness, the knowing, and see everything else as an object of that. So when you come to the moment of death, that chitta will be shorn of all its supports and all its auxiliaries. Everything falls away, and then afterwards the mind arises again somewhere else. Now, the Buddha was quite clear about making the distinction to try and dispel the confusion that there is that consciousness here which moves someplace else. There's no thing that goes from life to life. There's a process of continuity of cause and effect. It's been described as consciousness arising again to like conditions. So when the question is asked, as it is in the Milinda Panya, is the consciousness which arises in the new birth, is it the same or different? The answer is neither the same nor different. And a metaphor is given of an echo. If you make a shout against a cliff face and then you hear your voice coming back, is that voice the same or different?
And